Super. So, thank you everyone for joining into the session. We are very excited for today's session. The topic is Display Takes the Leads on Digital Marketing Growth. And if you are a digital marketer who works on display advertising, this session offers a deep dive into how the ecosystem has actually evolved in year 2018, post the ITP and GDPR world. With the data regulation being an important factor, the ad relevance has obviously got a spin-off to the debate, and we'll discuss about what are the views and what are the factors that everyday digital marketers should be considering while designing an effective strategy. And we'll also take up some solutions which Google Display Ads has to offer to solve those challenges. And for leading the session, we have Chandrasekhar Mullidharan. He is a display ad specialist at Google. So thank you so much, Chandrasekhar, for joining into the session, and we love to hear your thoughts on the same.
All right, thank you, Divya. And thank you all of you who are joining in this afternoon. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm assuming all of you are joining in from different parts of India and probably abroad. But if you're from Hyderabad, today has been a very peaceful day on the streets. It's election day here, which means it's a holiday for offices, schools, and colleges. And while everything is peaceful out there, I'm sitting here at my desk in office talking to you guys, which is great, by the way. I'm just looking forward to a very good discussion with you, hearing your thoughts, your questions on the same. Maybe some ideas that we discussed today, you should be able to take back to your teams. You should be able to take back to the drawing board, and based on that, maybe think about how you can frame your display strategy. But we'll get started, and then it's going to be about a 45-minute discussion, but it could be more or less depending on the kind of questions that we see. But essentially, what we'll be talking about is putting numbers to the whole story. As Divya mentioned earlier, 2018 was a crazy year for all of us, and not just in India, but across the world, where data regulation really took the front stage. It was front and center of almost all the conversation. And that's been a big, let's say, tectonic shift in where display advertising has gone. We talk a little bit about what the numbers stack up over there and where we can really identify the opportunity there. We'll also talk a little bit about, I'm sorry for the lag, give me a second. Oops. I'm sorry. If you guys are on the line, I'm sorry, I'm seeing some kind of issues with my laptop. Please stay on the line. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm really sorry, my laptop's acting up. It's been doing that with the webinar launcher every day. Sorry, so I've been testing it and it keeps doing that. Sorry. All right, so there you go. I'm just gonna keep it to this for a while and then we'll jump back in. So yes, the second thing that we're gonna talk about is data protection, what's really happening over there, what the road ahead essentially looks like for especially those display teams that focus a lot on ad tech. The third thing that we're going to talk a little bit about, and this is where I'm going to bring in a little bit about a little of my perspective from working with advertisers through Google, where I can talk a little bit about the solutions that Google offers. Other than that, just in generally some ideas that you can take back to your teams. Ad clutter, now a terminology that has been around ever since there have been ads, but some ideas around where the inventory model essentially is headed and what ads really mean on that front. And finally, a little bit about attribution. Display attribution has never been a conversation for the longest time because we never thought of display as a performance solution, but that has evolved, especially in 2017 and 2018 with the rise of programmatic and real-time bidding. But we'll talk a little bit about valuing display differently as well. So with that, I'll just jump straight into the conversation and present my screen. Now, thinking about the landscape and with numbers putting to it, I think the age-old debate that has always been between display advertising and performance-based advertising has been the share of wallet. And I think on that front, the one big inflection point that kind of happened in 2018 is where display actually started showing growth, especially in India and APAC, but also across the world. But the concerning factor also is that there seems to be some deceleration that's happening due to industry and economic factors, and that's expected to keep going post 2020. Now, the area that you're seeing shaded in green, now that's an area that, to be honest, is still a bit of a black box because we still don't know how other factors such as rise in smartphone usage, change in inventory, increased video consumption. India has now become a thriving market for video consumption, and things like that are really going to shape the future. And we are not certain what 2020 and post that is going to look. So I'd say take those numbers with a pinch of salt, or maybe even a bag full of salt. Now, as we discussed earlier, all of the growth that's coming in is currently being fueled by programmatic buying. And that's really given the steroid that the display industry always required. Having a sound trading desk and having a sound buying mechanism has suddenly taken center stage in most display conversations, not just at an India level, but globally as well. And the deceleration that we spoke about earlier is mostly because the sector itself is approaching maturity. But like I said earlier, that green zone that you're seeing in 2020 could easily be like a turnaround story, and we don't know what's going to happen there. So the question here remains: what do we do with this new, let's say, dynamic shift that has happened? If you look at the numbers and if you look closely at what happens post 2019, the numbers are on the rise when it comes to a percentage share of total digital ad spend. Now, this is a very, very incredible moment because 5 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, nobody would have envisioned this because performance-based advertising was all about search. It was all about affiliate marketing. It was all about getting in those leads. But display was always considered as that, as that one banner ad that you invest in at some point of time. But that's changed, and how display really fits in different segments of your business has become a big conversation, and that's the result of why you see that bottom row now going. So it's close to 60%, and it's only going to be on the rise. Again, we spoke about this shift to smartphones, increased media consumption, OTTs. This is what is driving the business. It's what's driving the market, and that's what's making the need for more display advertising in the economy. Now, the second thing, this is something that I think from a display standpoint has always been true. Display ads are more engaging. Display ads are more about interesting formats that cut at clutter, but it's going to become more and more relevant. To the earlier slide that we spoke about, where there is deceleration happening on the overall ad industry, not just for India, but globally as well. It only means that we'll have to get smarter and smarter at how we try to engage our audience. If not, things can go downslide very, very quickly. I'll just pause for a second if there are any questions on the board. Divya? Yeah, I forgot to mention maybe at the beginning that if you have any questions, just keep them coming. There's no need to wait towards the end because it really helps move the conversation in a more interactive manner. I typically find webinars a bit challenging because I feel like I'm just talking to something with nothing coming back. But if there are questions, don't wait for the end. Just go ahead and ask them, and Divya should be able to relay them back. If
We have
not,
got
I
a question.
let's take
People
one
actually
question.
there are there's one common question that how does programmatic buying is impacting and what exactly it is.
Great point.
But no,
So
not none of the questions.
that's a great question. Now, programmatic buying. I'm sure that all of you who are dialed into this conversation have come across programmatic buying in some meeting at some point of time in the last 2 years. And programmatic buying itself is a very blanket term, which talks about how the technology through which you now buy your display inventory or now you access your display inventory has changed. For example, in the beginning, when we had display advertising, it was all network driven, where you had to do deals across different publishers, you had to do deals across different walled networks in order to be able to fully realize the full potential of the internet. But now with programmatic buying, what's changed is the different ways in which you can buy inventory, which means, for example, you could be buying inventory through direct deals, through private auctions, or you could just enter the open auction and use machine learning to define what your auction bid can look like. All of that can be done through the same system or the same console. And that's what programmatic buying really means. It's the ability to use data Combine that with incredible reach that is provided by a single platform in order to reach the right audience. And when I say right audience, that right audience should differ depending on the marketing objective that you're going after. If your marketing objective is branding, you should be able to figure out what the right CPM is. Similarly, if your marketing objective is to get conversions or leads, you should be able to get the efficiency that you deserve for your business through that interface. And that's what programmatic really is. Now, I'm probably giving you an answer which touches literally the tip of the iceberg. And the reason behind that is that the market is so segmented that programmatic buying can potentially be true for one segment, but may not be as effective for another. But the reason programmatic buying is really propelling the industry forward is it's given it a new lease of life or a new way to access inventory, which was not possible or was not efficient before. 5 years before this, we probably didn't have the tools that we have now to understand how to reach the audience as effectively, but we do have that now. And not just tools that help access audience, but tools that also give us insights about that audience. And these insights combined with the ability to reach have actually propelled the industry forward. Divya, I think we can take one question at a time and we can just keep moving forward. And then next time we pause, we'll have another question.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you for that question. Keep those questions coming and we will try to address most of them. If we do have some questions which get left out, we'll try to cover them in the end. Now, what I was talking about earlier, again, the reason programmatic buying or display evolution has also been a big change is the way inventory itself is changing. When I say inventory, I'm talking about all of those web pages where your ads eventually show up. Now, I'm just putting a Google lens to this, but this is true for outside Google as well. The focus on owned and operated properties, which includes the likes of Gmail, YouTube, and whatnot, has become a big focus area in 2018. And the big reason behind that is I'm sure that you've come across a lot of this discussion in the past, but advertisers now want to approach display advertising more carefully and they want to be more committed and we want to be more thoughtful about what's good for their brand. And that's where owned and operated properties have really been a strong player. And that's what's propelling. Also, combine this with the fact that most owned and operated properties today have helped consolidate the audience market in the world. And for example, something like Gmail has almost 1 billion plus users in the world. And even in India, it is one of the leading, let's say, inventory, so to say. YouTube, I don't even have to talk about that, has become a leader in the video space as well. So each of these owned and operated properties have consolidated the way in which you access inventory today. Now, combine that with the fact that you have publishers who, oops, there she goes again. Sorry, guys. Really sorry about my laptop. While this is loading, Divya, if there are more questions, I can take them. Can you hear me?
No, we don't have any questions for now. I think, yeah, no questions for now.
Okay. Really sorry about the lag. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's election day in Hyderabad, which means that most, there you go. Sorry, I'm gonna have to jump back very quickly. Now, I'll just keep it to this. What I was talking about earlier is we have owned and operated properties and we have the huge network of website and apps, which we spoke about as well. But in general, third-party exchanges also become a big player. And having reach across through remarketing with access to these exchanges becomes a big way of figuring out how you should really plan your display strategy. And access to inventory is then now a big component of how your display strategy works. If you don't reach the right kind of inventory, you're most likely missing out on potential conversions and leads that are coming in from an audience. And that's the definition of reaching the right inventory is that you use the right targeting and you use the right bidding strategy to ensure that you're there in the moment that really matters. And if you're not going to be there in the moment that really matters, somebody else will. And that's a core component of how your display strategy needs to start evolving. We'll talk a little bit more about what can we do today to ensure that we do access all of this inventory and what is the most simple or scalable way of doing this. But we'll talk about that a little bit later in the conversation when we discuss a little bit about ad clutter. Now, the question which is on everybody's mind, which is data regulation and policies. What's happening there? What does it mean for the industry, and where does it take us from here? Now, if we keep our digital marketers hat aside and just put our user face on, uh, a lot of these comments would probably be true of the way we look at the internet today as well. I mean, regardless of whether we are in the display ad industry or in the larger digital ad industry, we still get sometimes frustrated when, and it's just ironic that this is happening even as we speak, that we are having a frustrating experience with slow load. But yes, imagine this happening with ads, and how frustrating that can be. The second thing that's changing is publishers are trying to find the balance between quality content and what really makes a good consumer experience. Um, internet's the internet is made up of publishers of different scale, different size, and different objectives. And to be able to have a financial viability plus have a great experience for your customers, for your consumers, and keep them coming back and maintain that long-term value is a very challenging component. The third bit is that there is a bit of mistrust that has come into the ecosystem, and that's because it's been a very very meteoric rise from, let's say, 2004 up until 2017, and the ecosystem has become so much more complex and it's less transparent, it's more complex, and at times advertisers also feel that it may not be safe for their brand. So what do you do about this very complicated scenario where almost all the three components of what makes a great digital strategy, which is users, publishers, and advertisers, all three of them have some kind of feedback about where the ecosystem is headed? Now, combine this with, let's say, how our policies look today. In the US, we have California Consumer Privacy Act. China has its own cybersecurity law. We obviously have GDPR in the EU. Even in India, there is a data protection bill, which is constantly in the news. If I have to put a number to this, uh, almost $7.8 billion were spent sometime mid this year in preparation for GDPR, which includes advertisers who predominantly focus on not just Europe, but advertisers outside Europe who also focus on users within Europe. So include this number seems huge, but consider this. Without this number having been invested, brands would never be ready for GDPR. And if you have been following the news, the fines and the compliance that was required with GDPR was extremely severe. And 7.8 billion in contrast to that probably seems like a small figure. But the idea is that advertisers, brands, publishers, everybody has to now prepare for a world where a lot of the compliance will define how well they can succeed in their objectives. Here, very close to home in India, in 2017, almost 193 millions were, and this is potential ad revenue lost. I'm not talking about ad revenues that were shaved off, but potential opportunity which was lost due to ad blockers. Now, many of you will be like, "Hey, is this doomsday? Is this where the industry is headed? Is this the end of the world for display as we think of it?" A lot of the conversations that you have in coffee tables and coffee rooms is, "Hey, maybe cookies are not the right approach anymore. Maybe we can't store data the way we used to anymore." And it probably means the end for ad tech. That's the doomsday picture that almost everyone has. The flip side of looking at this is maybe this is a renaissance, which means if you look at numbers a little bit more deeply, the flip side to spending a lot on compliance also is countered by spending a lot on buying third-party audience data. The estimate for 2018 on global spend on buying third-party data is close to 19 billion. That's a huge figure. And it's not just about buying data, but also buying data that gives marketers the ability to view an audience across devices and channels. We are no longer looking at different data silos for an audience. We are looking at audience connecting different signals to make a single profile of an audience, which really helps us go deeper into understanding where the intent lies and where we can position that audience in the consumer journey. And that's a huge leap that the industry has taken. And I'd like to say that one of the factors behind that has been a conscious approach towards data consolidation, which came as a result of data compliance as well. So it's two sides of the scale, and there is always going to be a bit of difficulty in finding the right balance. But the positive note that I want to take is that data compliance only means that we start becoming more thoughtful about how we actually approach our audience data. And it's not just about data, it's also about content. And that's where something that you would probably come across before is the Coalition for Better Ads. Now, the Coalition for Better Ads is an effort that's almost taken a couple of years or more, and it's incredible how, in a very very small space, advertisers, agencies, publishers, and trade bodies across the entire industry actually came together to put a strong step forward in actually making it better for users to be on the internet and experience content. Uh, Now, a little bit about what it's doing, and this is again from the lens or from my perspective of having worked with some of these advertisers. We're trying to make better ads by busting bad ads, which means we remove bad ads. We look at research across consumers in Europe and US, and now also approaching Asia, and also improving our browsers, improving our tools that filter all those annoying ads. Raising the bar on content. Like I mentioned earlier, publishers are no longer looking at quality of content as second or third priority. It's number one priority going forward. And again, when it comes to having owned and operated content as well, we're very thoughtful about what kind of verification can actually be built into those systems. Again, machine learning plays a big factor in determining how to actually keep a check on content and how essentially ads can continue to be operated in a safe environment. Now, again, trying to bring in more control and trying to bring in more transparency, giving it back to advertisers. Now, using third-party verification, having simpler controls, that becomes a big ask that going forward, if you're a display, if you're someone who heavily invests in display, should be looking forward to. And not just that, but also looking at the right measurement criteria. One of the biggest factors in actually driving a better safe ad environment is making sure that you're using the right partners, you're using the right platforms for data accreditation. And that is where a big move in the industry has come forth, where there is partnerships across the board, across platforms and channels, which allow for a lot of this information to be shared. So make the most of this information which is available to get more transparency out of the platforms that you're investing in. And again, there are plenty of partners out there. It's not just Google, but there's plenty of other platforms that are part of this coalition. And there is some hope, and there is a lot of positivity that's now getting fed back into the ecosystem. And 2019 is going to be a much better year in terms of how we define data safety as well as much better ad quality. So just to quickly summarize what we spoke in the last, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes. India and almost the whole world, there's a huge digital growth story, and India is a leading, let's say, example of that. And display advertising is an engine that will help us realize this. It will help a lot of brands realize this growth opportunity that's coming through as a result of more users being on smartphones, more users accessing the internet for the first time, and essentially looking at how they would like to get and absorb content from publishers. I must apologize again for the issue with the lag. And while we are pausing and hoping that my laptop loads quickly enough, Divya, if you have any questions on the group, and if you have any questions, just fire them away and we'll talk about it.
Superb. So we have some question.
Mhm.
Um, what is the best way to design an effective display ad? And what
Superb.
are the ideas that you keep in mind?
So we're going to dive into exactly that component. So I'll come back to that as we talk about audience and automation, and I'll keep that question on hold. Is there anything else on what we just discussed?
Not as such. No, no more questions.
Perfect. Then this is the perfect segue that I could have had to the next section. I'll just cover up. I'll just summarize what we just spoke. We spoke about the digital growth story and display being the growth engine. Policies continuing to regulate data and tech, but if you can pivot to ensuring you're maximizing on the right audience, that's a good counter to have in this environment. And finally, you're hitting maturity levels, so reinvent and segment your ad reach with engaging formats. Now, talking about how to design the best, let's say, display campaign, or let's say how do you put a framework to this. Now here, if you're we'll try a quick activity. So if you're in front of your laptops, or if you have access to the internet through your phones, just quickly type in what you see on the screen, and I'll give you, let's say, a minute to be able to do that. Alternatively, you could also go into google.com and type in ad preferences Google or Google ad preferences, and it should be ideally the first link that appears. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this. If you can confirm with a yes, then I shall go ahead. All right. I'm hoping most of you were able to access the interface that probably looks a little like this. Now, this is actually my personal view, and I'm actually sharing it with you in all trust. But you should be able to see something a little bit more personal for yourself and based on your browsing behavior. Now, why am I showing you this, and why is this such a critical component of what a great display strategy means? The biggest missed opportunity in creating a great display strategy is when we don't use the available signals or the available intelligence or data that's at hand. And again, thinking of it from a Google display standpoint or from any display campaign standpoint, one of the biggest drivers of how you can really have the right solution, which ensures that it's comprehensive and at the same time it's effective, is how well you can segment your audience. We'll talk a little bit more about the creative and the bidding component, but it all begins with how well you can segment your audience. If you keep your brand as the center of the conversation, and if you're able to segment the market in understanding what each segment really expects from that brand, and I'm going to a little bit of the basics at the moment, but I'll come back to how display really looks at it. When you segment that audience, you automatically understand what kind of success metric you can associate or what kind of expectation you can set for each of those segments. For example, if you look at common behavioral patterns across different users, you will find that it's very hard to pinpoint an individual segment of an audience and expect them to do only one thing. You cannot expect all car enthusiasts to keep buying cars all the time. Similarly, you can't expect only people who are interested in travel or they are travel freaks to actually go out there and buy a flight ticket. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive and definitely not exhaustive in terms of the audience segments that you can go after. And understanding how different users exhibit different behaviors at different points in their journey and in their interaction with your brand is what really makes or is a good starting point for defining what your display advertising can look like. Again, this seems like a very, very broad statement or a very, very broad stroke. How do we put some kind of framework to this? Now, let's start about looking at facts about their life, demographics, or things that you're already aware of, from an employment status to home ownership to household income, to looking at what they are typically interested in. And finally, looking at the intent and action that you can potentially expect from that audience. Now, based on facts about their life, or based on what they're interested, or based on what the decision making process looks like, you can allocate what you can essentially expect this audience to do for your brand. An audience which is purely, let's say, in a certain stage of their life may or may not be aware of your brand. But if you go deeper into understanding their interest, you will know if they actually have any or they exhibit any behavior which makes them a great, let's say, champion of your brand. Now, let's put a framework to this, and I'll come back to this conversation now. But if you talk about the broadest addressable user, and you as a brand or as a display specialist or as a display campaign designer or a display campaign manager, what you'd like to do is address the most broad user in how they'd like to see your brand. Now, this is that stage in your marketing campaign where you can't expect this addressable audience to purchase your brand on day one. It's not going to happen. The reason is that neither does the consumer journey or the stage in the consumer journey allow them to have that kind of interaction with your brand, or neither does the amount of information you are showing in front of them let you do that. Similarly, if you go one step closer, this is where the consideration set really becomes an important component of your digital strategy. If you're a brand which is not part of your audience's consideration set, it becomes really hard for you to break through and be that face when they actually want to make that purchase. So at some point of time, if your audience is thinking, you will find that it's not enough to just be there. you have to deliver a little bit more than just being there, and you have to put yourself out there to ensure that your audience can explore and know more about you. And here's where your targeting or your audience segmentation gets deeper. Now, I'll pause here and I'll go back to what we were talking about earlier. And I want you to focus on the first two cards. When we spoke about being the brand that your audience can see, the biggest component or the biggest uh, element of how successful your display campaign can get is how well you can reach that audience. For example, if you are restricting your campaign or if you're restricting your strategy to a very small segment, a very niche segment of your market, you've already defined that as your addressable user journey. Sorry, your addressable user set. And any journey that follows thereon will just be for that niche audience. And as you keep progressing, it gets more and more niche, which is potentially detrimental to your campaigns. But if you start broad and you look at a wider demographic of an audience based on their relationship status, based on their income, based on their education, you realize that you have a much broader play now. Going back to the think component of what we were talking about, that's where things like when an audience is in market for something, or when the audience exhibits or displays intent for something, really comes into play. For example, I may be a car enthusiast, but I may not be in market for buying a car. And that's where the difference between essentially just being there and letting an audience see your brand versus letting an audience think about your brand really becomes a big, big component. If you're trying to show an ad to an audience that's in market for a car, you're not really going to talk to them about just your brand. You're going to talk to them a little bit more about how easy or how convenient it is for them to know more about you. One of the examples that I keep talking about is very recently I was actually at a showroom to buy a car for my father, and we still haven't completed that purchase. But the minute we walked in, one of the first things that happened was with the sales representative who was in the room, essentially came up to us and said, "Hey, how you doing? Blah blah blah." He got a good sense of what kind of car we're looking for between mid-range and sedan and so on. And then within 5 minutes of that conversation, the person who was talking to us essentially told us that let's sit inside, have some tea, and continue this conversation. And I found that extremely surprising. The reason behind that is it had been just 5 minutes since I had stepped into the showroom, and there were cars on either side of where I was standing, and there were cars of different models and make, and I had a fair idea of which car I wanted. But within minutes of being there, the salesperson was drawing me away and inside into a room to probably talk about offers and deals and price points when I had not even fully made up my mind on what kind of car I wanted to go to. So I spoke to this person and I said, "Hey, but can I just stand here and look at the cars? Can I sit inside? Can I get a feel of the steering wheel? Can I let my father sit and get him a feel of what's comfortable for him?" And what eventually happened was every 5 minutes somebody from the sales team in the showroom would actually come to us and try to keep taking us inside for tea. And at some point of time, I actually stopped and said, "Hey, do you want me to buy a car, or do you want me to buy your couch, or maybe just tell you how great your tea is?" And that's where a display campaign tends to kind of break. If you're not segmenting your audience enough and understanding how to essentially to reach that audience. Now, when it comes to things like intent and action, it doesn't stop with just targeting a user who's in market for something. Oops, this is happening way often than it should. But yeah, coming back to what we were talking about, the minute you move away from the think conversation, there is a component of display advertising which more often than not goes missed, is the do component, which is where you actually push an audience that is sitting on the fence to actually take an action. Here is where compelling formats like dynamic ads, and you find dynamic ads now across platforms, really makes a big difference. I feel one of the most missed potentials in display advertising at the moment is not leveraging things like your product feed, things like the information that's available on your website, to really display it in a dynamic fashion through your ad creatives, to really give users the ability to take a quick action. I work with advertisers in the United Kingdom, and one of the big wins, one of the most successful campaigns that we saw that ran on display advertising very recently during the Black Friday week was when we ran dynamic remarketing ads that showed the exact same product that a user was potentially looking at maybe a couple of hours ago, to just show them the right price point, to show them the right USPs, to show them the value add that it brings in. And we saw conversions happening then and there. And here's where the combination of using remarketing as well as what we call customer match, which is essentially using or leveraging your CRM data to show ads, really helps drive a lot of the successful last minute, last moment conversions. And that's where your display strategy effectively becomes complete. Now, I've stopped here and I've said that there's a bit of C, there's a bit of branding, there's a bit of awareness that works. There is a component where there is a consideration set that you necessarily need to be part of, where you tell your user everything about what your business stands for, what your brand means to them, but doesn't expect them to take an action. But immediately after you've done that, you use effective techniques to ensure that the do component or the action component also works. And this is where audience segmentation really works. The final component, which completes this cycle, is where you really build on value. So users who have already purchased, users who are part of your ecosystem, not ignoring them, but actually going back to them and building more loyalty becomes a much more critical component. And on the display network, we do have remarketing and customer match, as I showed you earlier, where we essentially complete the value of a campaign and extract 10 times more value out of it by going back to the same user at different stages in the consumer journey to build on what they've already done with us. There's a component of Google Analytics here as well, which we will touch in exactly 5 minutes from now. Now, what I'd like you to do is take 5 minutes, maybe write this in front of you. If you have an open slide, you can do it yourself. If you have a piece of paper, what I'd like you to do is just think about these components that we just discussed. Open it up in terms of framework of what kind of audience would you like to just simply see your brand and not do anything. What kind of audience would you like to actually start thinking and learning more about your brand, which is where the think component comes in? And what kind of audience would you actually like to take an action? Take 5 minutes, think about your brand or any brand that you work with. It doesn't have to be a brand that you work with as well. It can be something hypothetical, and simply write this down on a piece of paper. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about it, and I'll show you something that probably would appear relevant for one of the brands that I've worked with in the past. So I'll repeat this for anybody who could not hear me clearly the first time. Essentially, write these 4 words: see, think, do, and care. These 4 frameworks, and think about the brand that you work with, or just pick one brand that you work on, and then look at what kind of audience. Just write about that audience. What do you like? What would you like that user to be? What would you like that user to think about? What would you like that user to be doing at this moment when you want that audience to think about you? And I'll give you a couple of minutes to write it down, and then I'll show you what I mean from my perspective. If at this moment you have any questions, you can also ping or add them to the list that Divya is looking at, and I can take some questions as well. Divya, let me know if there are any questions.
People surely are asking about how to use this particular strategy to target B2B audience.
That's an interesting question. When you say B2B audience, I'd normally ask a
Business,
follow-up. I'm
the
sorry?
business, the business is in
Yes.
B2B.
Business to business. No, I get that component, but I'm thinking about, usually I'd have a follow-up question when it comes to B2B about why would it be any different from a B2C strategy? There are obvious differences in terms of the consumer journey, at what touch point your users would behave in a certain manner, and the kind of inventory that you would definitely want to show your ad on. But what would remain still consistent is the fact that you're still targeting decision makers. I've worked with clients in the B2B sector, and one of the things that I think from a narrative standpoint that we really found worked for one of my advertisers was the fact that when you're showing an ad to a user, at the end of the day, it is a user, regardless of whether your brand is a B2C or a B2B brand. The general journey or the obvious consumer journey that that particular user takes doesn't dynamically alter. For example, even if you're a B2B brand and you're showing an ad to a decision maker, that decision maker probably has an email within Gmail, or that user is viewing a video on YouTube. And that user also goes through the same cycle that any of these users go through that we were talking to earlier. What becomes more important then is the messaging, and how well the messaging can really target or talk about the benefits of what your brand really stands for. So if we go back to the see, think, do, care, the audience component of this does not change, but the messaging component then changes. For example, when it talks about, if you have to talk about the think component over here in a B2B environment, you don't expect the audience to spend only a couple of days to decide what the right solution is. For example, if you are a very large or a medium cloud service provider and you are looking at decision makers in small and medium enterprises that are looking at much more smarter ways to store their data, your conversation does not stop at you know going after an audience which is in that phase and expecting them to take a lead or take some kind of an economic activity with your brand within a couple of minutes or a couple of days. It's not going to happen. That's where you segment the audience further into expecting that audience to come for a trial version versus a fully paid version, which can happen as a do component, versus looking at an audience that is deeply invested already in your services and then continuously upselling or continuously growing their engagement with you through a care model, which is where using CRM data or using remarketing data really comes into play. Now, I'll reiterate this. The consumer journey probably looks different in terms of timelines for a B2B, for a B2C, but it doesn't, the way you would approach an audience or the targeting that you would use does not dynamically change. What changes is the messaging. What changes is the value proposition that you bring to that user. Now, if you've already completed the see, think, do, care, or at least taken a first stab at it, think about it this way. If you're an advertiser that's trying to or if you're part of an ecosystem where you're looking at users who are constantly on the go, who are taking journeys, let's take an example of what a C looks like. A C can be anyone. A C can be showing your brand or being there to someone who's interested in world music, someone who is between the ages 18 to 34, or someone who's watching a video about a traveler who is probably eating pho, which is like a ramen kind of thing in Vietnam. But as you go deeper down the consumer journey or deeper into the audience mindset, you understand a little bit more about what do they think about. Maybe I'm thinking about what is the right data plan to take when I travel to Vietnam. Maybe I'm looking at flight tickets for traveling to Vietnam. And that's where being present to give information back to that audience is the only and the best engagement model you can have with that audience. If you go deeper down that purchase journey, you will find that in the do stage where you're looking at really taking or getting that user to have an action, that's where something like car rental or maybe just ordering a book that I want to read on a flight, that becomes a very critical last minute moment or last minute split second action that I have to take. And that's where maybe looking at someone who is just added a book to the cart but not really gone ahead and purchased it, but showing them while they're on the go on their smartphone really makes a big difference. Finally, if you have to close the entire journey, if you have to talk about what's the care component, the care component could be an action like booking a homestay or a hostel via a travel social site. Now, travel sites are slowly taking on a social component, as you would have seen some of the top players in the industry doing. That's the whole reason behind that, is that on the display component, re-engagement is a very, very big component, be it on apps, be it on websites, but re-engagement through continuously giving them something new and bringing them back to the ecosystem makes a big difference. And here's where remarketing, or here's where leveraging your CRM data and effectively using email marketing to do that really makes a big difference. If you haven't already done this, but this model can really simplify the narrative or the audience segmentation that you can go back and use as a drawing board exercise. What I can do is when Divya does share these slides with you, I can add a couple more examples which can really help you understand this a little better as well. But moving on, all of this audience information, all of this is now getting consumed at a much, much larger scale than it did probably 8 years ago. And in general, the audience composition itself is changing, which means it's not enough for us to just think about audience segmentation. And there is very little that we as, let's say, human beings can apply. Combining consumer insights, which actually gives you a little bit of an idea about how your design and your strategy can look, is incomplete if you're not combining that with the power of machine learning or the power of computer performance. And this is where your strategy, regardless of it actually goes from being a simple thought exercise on a drawing board to actually going out there and becoming an active strategy, which is on the programmatic platform that we spoke about earlier. One of the case studies, and here's something that actually worked for one of my customers very, very recently, is using something called automated targeting. So on the display network, and you will find that there are similar solutions on other platforms and channels as well, we have something called automated targeting, which really allows you to use your data to go out there and drive more successful leads in the display ad ecosystem. So what auto targeting effectively lets you do is, if you've already generated a fair amount of clicks and a fair amount of conversions from your existing display strategy, where you have probably segmented your audience and been very, very thoughtful about going out to a certain segment of the users, what auto targeting really does is it takes all of that information, goes out there, and gets you more and more information which you potentially couldn't have reached through your manual audience targeting. If you're familiar with something like smart display campaigns, what it really does is it mines the data that you already have and then finds similar data out there using a combination of close to a billion signals, which, again, like I said, we as individuals, we as human beings cannot really process. It really goes out there and gets that information back and delivers value for you. So the point over here is audience is incomplete without the power of automation. And again, when it comes to automation, it's not restricted to just targeting, but it's focusing on the bidding component as well. One component of programmatic, which I'd like to stress on over here, is the ability for a platform to really synthesize all of this information and make it meaningful in terms of how it can define whether an auction is valuable for your business or not. So with the millions of auctions that are happening every hour, what real-time bidding means is it should be able to process the data that you already have and really start making sense, being able to dissect it on its own, being able to draw patterns on its own, and then figure out for the next auction that your brand is eligible for, what is the right bid that you should go after to ensure that you get the most in terms of the return, or the most value in terms of the return on the investment that you've made. And the automation component, like I said, it's not restricted to just bidding, but it also goes back to targeting. And what I'd like to leave as a message is, if you're thinking about the most effective display targeting, always factor a certain percentage. In my opinion, that should be somewhere between 25 to 30% for leads or for conversions coming in through automation. If you're not looking at 25 to 30% already that's coming in for automation, you're going to find that it's going to be harder year over year to grow in the environment that we are in. Because, as I mentioned earlier, with all of the data and compliance issues, it's going to be even more important to rely on the data that we already have and actually activating it in the best possible manner. Now, I'll pause here for a second. If there are no questions, I will come back to the topic of automation in a while, because there's an analytics component to it as well. But in the interest of time, I'll just quickly jump into the fourth segment that we wanted to talk about today, which is ad clutter. Now, if you remember, one of the questions that was posed earlier was about how do you make the most of this strategy from a B2B standpoint. But again, and one of the things that we spoke about was how during Black Friday, we found that having very, very last minute ads or very, very dynamic ads that go out there really made a big difference. But the other thing that really makes a big difference in display advertising is having the right reach. If you remember, we also spoke about how fragmented the inventory has become, which makes it really hard for a display advertiser to have the right format, to have the right ad size, to have the right kind of messaging that can go out there and reach the user in the best and most optimal design. What has become a big leap in the way ads are now being created or ads are now being shown to users is they're a lot more responsive. When I talk about responsive, it means the system, as a result of all the automation that's gone in, has a little bit more control on how the ads are displayed. For example, if you look at things like ad optimization, which can be potentially a tactical lever, a lot of that component now relies or lies more with the system than it does with an individual. So auto ad resizing, auto ad coloring, auto ad adjustment, where the images can be optimized to ensure that it's showing up for the right screen. More than that, but even looking at a combination of different assets, which includes, let's say, the copy that's part of the display ad, being able to optimize for that as well. So if you can give the system 15 different ad copies, the system uses that to understand what kind of audience the ad is being shown on, dynamically optimize it over a period of time, and effectively go back and deliver only those ads and those copies that in combination work the best. In fact, within display ad ecosystem for Google, you will find that there is a report that also helps you understand which assets or which copy actually works better, which doesn't, and there is an ability where you can enable the system to actually optimize it on your behalf. So a combination of these things, a combination of having more responsive ads that auto size and auto scale, really helps you ensure that regardless of what the inventory is, that's complexity that's taken away from you, that's complexity that the machine learning takes care of, where regardless of what the inventory type is, regardless what the audience is, the system is able to optimize the right creative and cut through that ad clutter. It essentially looks and feels much better than how display ads would always have. And in fact, one of the biggest driving forces over here, and one of the biggest driving forces here also has been image quality. So looking at image quality in the true lens of what components of an image quality really helps cut through clutter. And all of this goes and gets optimized through the system, which really helps you cut through that ad clutter. Why is ad clutter becoming such a big component? And I'll jump straight into that. I'll skip some of these sections in the interest of time. But the biggest factor that's driving the whole conversation around ad clutter is the fact that there is a format called native display ads, which is rising very quickly. The way users perceive ads today, and users now being more conscious of what the internet looks like and what they really want to take back from it, don't want the hacky, the kind of ads that was probably true for a decade ago. A decade ago, an ad like this on a page like this would have probably made sense, but the ads today have evolved a lot. And I'm just going back not too far, but I'm just going back 2 years ago, and you will find that the ads have optimized for the screen, the ads have optimized for the inventory, the ads have optimized for the user. But in spite of that, at times, what's more disappointing is ads still look like they belong 10 years ago. And the reason behind that is the lack of investment that actually goes into understanding what native advertising really means. And native advertising will define how well you can exist in that ecosystem. What native advertising really means is content that looks very, very seamless, and content that looks very, very true to the look and feel of the content. Now, one way of looking at this can also be that, hey, maybe I'm trying to deceive the user into thinking that this is content. The other way to think about it can also be that, hey, if my content is relevant, and that, by the way, becomes a big component in native advertising as well, is making sure that the ad is relevant to the content as well. If my ad is relevant to the content, it is probably relevant to the user in the natural flow of the way in which the user is absorbing all of that. And one of the biggest points that I mentioned was a big factor behind the ecosystem evolving is publishers trying to balance between quality of ads and quality of content, but at the same time surviving and being able to monetize. And native advertising really helps them find that balance. It helps them ensure, obviously, that the right ad is showing to the right user at the right time, and there is no lack of quality. By the way, from an ad serving standpoint, quality still is a big component of how Google Display Ads run, and that continues to be there. But the second component is also that the look and feel of the ad doesn't seem hacky, and that's where this balance really plays out. Apologies. So now I want to pause here because we have just under 5 minutes till the end of this session. If you have any questions at the moment, Divya, I can take them right now, or I can dive straight into the last component that we had for today.
Let's go into the last component.
All right, then. So all of this, when it comes to cutting through ad clutter, defining the right audience, or using automation, is incomplete if you're not attributing the right value to display. Over time, as the evolution for display ads have happened, the consumer journey has always been perceived to end with a last click, which can either be a direct or through an email referral or through your search ads. And we always assume that display really doesn't add that much value. And we always assume that because display comes very early in the consumer journey, that's exactly where you would like display to be. However, the flip view of looking at this, and here is where analytics plays a big role, is not just looking at display as a first click or an early impression conversation, but I'm sorry, this is taking a couple more seconds to load. Stay with me. Apologies, give me a couple more seconds and this should work out. All right. Coming back to Google Analytics, even though display may not be the last click, the component or the way to evaluate the value of display campaigns is looking a bit more into what we call assisted conversions. Now, some of you who have worked on Google Analytics or use it in your everyday business would probably be familiar with this view. But what this view really tells you is that one of the insights that you have to look for is how does display really influence the larger journey or the success of other channels within your digital marketing portfolio, how your digital marketing strategy looks. Now, in the sequence, the targeting strategy might be looking different for different optimal paths, but what the optimal path effectively tells you is the actual true value that your display campaigns are adding, which you potentially tend to miss if you're valuing display at last click. Not just that, but you can also use some pre-built tools within Google Analytics, such as Solutions Gallery, which has a list of already pre-created segments that can help you understand your display reporting better. You can also use something called Smart List to actually activate some of this display reporting to go back in the form of using them as a remarketing list in your Google Ads campaign. Or you can use something called Audience Builder, where you can further segment based on engagement metrics, further segment it based on devices, further segment it based on behavioral components, such as what categories is your audience in market for, or what specific interests and hobbies your audience definitely does have. So you can segment it to further understand the value that a display campaign brings to your larger display or larger digital marketing strategy. So each of these components effectively allows you to attribute or credit more value to your display campaigns. If I have to summarize the three things that, or the three broad themes that we spoke about, and I'll go back to the fact that assigning credit and being able to think beyond last click is what helps you give the right amount of value to your display campaigns. In the scope of the larger ecosystem and how display is growingly becoming, because of programmatic buying and video and the way people are engaging and consuming content, becoming a much more critical component of your digital marketing strategy than they should be. So use last click value go beyond last click value to be able to get that right picture. The second component is being able to test and iterate. So automation combination with audience really gives you the opportunity to test and experiment different theories and different hypotheses about what kind of audience segmentation your ads should go after. What alphas and different betas that different platforms and channels provide is they let you experiment and access inventory in very, very unique ways. So make the most of it. And finally, when it comes to automation itself, or when it comes to data itself, being able to import a lot of the data that you have in the form of CRM lists, in the form of audience lists, or even in the form of pure conversions to actually drive more automated targeting is what really helps you leverage a lot of the actual intelligence and performance that the system is able to deliver on your behalf. So leverage automation and machine learning to the most to be able to make sense of that data. If not, it's a criminal waste of expenditure on data, which is probably huge potential, which has gone missed. Now, I will pause here because we are at the end of our discussion. And I would like to apologize for the breaks that we had in between as a result of my very, very slow laptop, which I think has something to do with the fact that there is very limited support where I'm standing right now. There's very limited air conditioning as well. But yes, a lot of it has to, a lot of this can be clarified when we share this as a post read, which Divya should be able to share with you. But I will pause here. I
Super.
still have.
Thank you so much, Shekhar. I think we can open up the questions for a minute or so, and I'll also launch out a poll for people who are interested in the digital marketing course. So we are giving out a minute for questions. Um, Thank you so much, Shekhar. We loved the presentation and we loved how you explained everything to us.
Not a problem. And again, I'm probably leaving some of those questions open because of the lack of time on my end. But yes, I'm here as long as everybody who can be on the call can stay. The longer you can stay and the more questions we can talk about, it's better for all of us, I guess.
Yeah, we got some questions in between, but I think most of them have been answered at the last bit of how to actually go about and find the right value for your business. So I think, and everyone who is wondering if they missed a part of the session, you will get the recording, you will get the presentation to deliver to your inbox by Tuesday, latest by Tuesday. So you can catch up through the recording and the presentation as well.
I think maybe in summary, what I would say is there are three big components which are seeing a big quantum change in approach. One is ads, where we are looking at more auto size, responsive, dynamic creatives, which really help take a lot of the load away from your creative teams in creating different banners and different compositions each time. So leverage some of those abilities that almost every platform today provides, and Google Display Ads does in a great way through dynamic and responsive ads. The second is the audience component, which is being able to put a framework to thinking what you expect your audience to do at different stages in the consumer journey. Do you just want them to know that you exist as a brand? Do you want them to consciously think about what your brand really delivers? So don't be that guy who drags, or don't be that person who drags you as a customer deeper into the consumer journey without really giving them the time to explore your brand fully, because it will only result in more churn for users. So be conscious about the think phase of your campaigns. Be more conscious about how you use intent based. So on the Google Display Ads platform, we have in-market segments, which really helps you reach users who are exploring, and giving them the right, let's say, resources or the tools from your brand to let them explore more about you and take a much more informed decision. And then there's the do and the care component of the audience segment, where you effectively use your CRM data or your remarketing data to go back to them all the time, like complete the cycle. Without completing the cycle, the overall strategy really becomes ineffective. If you're testing only prospecting at a time, it's never going to look good. But always test prospecting and remarketing together, and not just test them for audience. And that's where the third component, which is the third A, which is automation. Make sure that you're using automation to go back and effectively use the data that you have to multiply that, exponentially grow that by letting machine learning, which again Google Display offers in the form of auto targeting as well as smart bidding, use that to go out and make the most of the programmatic world that's out there. Finally, if I have to cap all these three A's, which is ads, audience, and automation, think about it from an attribution standpoint, which kind of completes the circle and becomes the fourth A in this entire journey. Make sure that you're thinking beyond last click and using tools within Google Analytics, using metrics within the Google Ads interface, which allows you to think beyond what kind of value a display campaign really adds, which may not be a last click conversion. But by quantifying that entire value, you would be assigning the right amount of credit, you would be assigning the right amount of investment to your campaigns, which really completes the overall circle of the four A's.
Super. Thank you so much for such a wonderful summary, Chandrasekhar. Thank you so much, guys. I think we are done with the questions as well. I'm just launching out a last poll to share how was the webinar and your experience for today's webinar. And thank you so much, Chandrasekhar, for taking your time out. We loved having you here after around 1.5 or 2 years, probably. So it's great having you here and listen to your experience, and we love the way how you summarized and shared so much information at such a short period of short time span. So thank you so much, guys. Have a great weekend. Bye bye.
Thank you.